So it's nice to take a moment and sense the community we're together with. We can be grateful to have this space to come together and around this value we have to be awake. I love this simple summary of the practice. It's maybe it's from Ajahn Sumedho, where he said it's the marriage of intimacy and non-attachment. And for me at least, and maybe for you too, that's something I can get behind. It just makes a lot of sense that as I live my life, not even formally in my meditation time, but just as I live my life, that I'd want to, just value being present, being intimate, but not all tied up in knots about what I'm being sensitive to. So released, but also right there, right? Sensitive to what's coming and going. And for me, this is really the attitude of loving kindness and compassion. So that's a good place to begin our sitting practice as we settle into a comfortable sitting posture. Eyes can be open or closed. And simple recognition, even if it's not the predominant attitude right now, but somewhere, isn't it possible to connect with the attitude that I, in fact, care about this life? I care about the activity of this body and mind right here and now. I care enough to be willing to be sensitive, to simply feel what's moving, what's coming and going here in the body and the mind, to be close as an act of kindness and compassion, this willingness to be close, which is really the opposite of denial, opposite of distraction. To be close, to continue to be close. So we're keeping the activity of the body and the mind, we're keeping the present moment in mind. We're not forgetting it because we care as an act of compassion and kindness. In a way, it's the one true gift that we give to ourselves and we give to the world. This capacity that we have to be present, intimate without attachment. And in giving this gift of wise presence, we receive the unavoidable healing, and we can even call it pleasure, the pleasure of this wholesomeness. And what's pleasurable is the giving, not always what we're opening to or feeling, right? Because we can be opening and feeling unpleasant bodily sensations, unpleasant emotions. We can be sensing confusion or doubt. But the opening to it, the generous presence, and the non-attachment, well, that's a beautiful thing. And it feels good to be wholly fully present with how it is in the body and the mind, moment by moment. So instead of looking for a nice experience to absorb into, instead we're uncovering this way of relating that will be good no matter the particular conditions that are showing up in the body and the mind. We relate with interest, including sensing and allowing, accepting, letting things be, what we call non-attachment. So let's play with these two values as we continue, whether we're specifically observing the breathing process in the body or more generally being present with the experience of the sitting body, or even more generally being aware of whatever's predominant in any moment, moment by moment. We can just be reflecting on these two values of intimacy, being open and allowing, and this acceptance, non-attachment, letting the moment reveal itself, letting it come, letting it go in its own way and in its own time. Intimacy and non-attachment. So we'll continue in silence now for about 30 minutes, a little less. And you can bring up these two values from time to time in a relaxed way and simply contemplate what it might mean to be intimate with experience, the activity of the mind and body as it actually is, and to contemplate what it might feel like, look like to be free of attachment with what's coming up in the body and the mind. So we're using the ideas of intimacy and non-attachment to illuminate how we can relate, how we can be with the experience of the body and the mind, the possibility of freedom. But when we contemplate intimacy, this possibility, we're recognizing the inclusive nature of the present moment, that it's all here and now. The entirety of the present moment is being known here and now. So it's not like we have to try to be intimate. It's more that we're recognizing that the heart is already sensitive to everything that's here, everything that's here and now. And as we contemplate this value of non-attachment, it's not really about trying to let go. It's more subtle and deeper as we're intimate with the way it is in the moment, the activity of the body and the mind. The non-attachment arises because there's really nothing solid, permanent to grasp. Even our ideas about things are coming and going and essentially unfixed. No solid ground, just movement. So we'd say letting go happens. We're recognizing that letting go or non-attachment happens. And if you notice some place where the heart feels stuck or tight, that's a good place to contemplate intimacy and non-attachment. Not trying to make anything happen, just what does it mean to be intimate, allowing it to be what it is. And realizing with patience, but realizing moments of non-attachment with whatever that is, whatever that frustration or resistance might be. So we're going to continue for another 2 or 3 minutes. So let's take a moment and adjust the body. It can be intimate and contemplate the possibility of non-attachment even as we move and take care of the body. Nice to be with everybody tonight. Thanks for showing up. So I do record on Tuesday evenings now, and so it's being live streamed. Just makes it a little easier instead of recording on Sunday mornings where I'll do the same or similar talk, but I have to wear a mask in public. So, and then also I'll put in the resources, or in the chat, some resources for tonight's talk, including Chapter 12 from Ajahn Chah's Collected Teachings, if you want to do a deeper dive into this topic. And it's sort of a traditional Theravada early Buddhist teaching tonight, and it's really okay if you don't like it, don't like the general content and tone, and the interesting thing is, I'm sure most of you know, sometimes medicine tastes horrible, horribly, and yet it may be good medicine still. And just keep that in mind in terms of spiritual teachings and spiritual practices. Some, we really like some of the practices and teachings. They just sort of align with the way we think and are relatively easy for us, and we like those. And then others really strike us as being, ooh, that doesn't feel right, or that, I don't like the sound of that. But it's, we don't want to believe it, these any teachings really, but we want to keep an open mind, almost as if we're putting it on a shelf. Okay, I don't really understand this, or I don't really agree with this, or I'm not sure about this, but I'll put it on my shelf, right? I know it's there, and I might grow into it, or it might be useful down the road, or maybe never, who knows. But it's really about that sense of humility, and if we already knew what we were doing, we wouldn't need to practice, would we? But we don't know what we're doing. So it's like the Buddha says, when human beings have some honest sense of dukkha, of just the pervasive, subtle and obvious unsatisfactoriness in life, they either complain and beat their breast and lament, or they undertake a search, like, I wonder if there's anybody who knows something about this human condition of suffering and its release. And not to believe it, like I said, but just, well, maybe I'll check that out then, and see if when I check it out, it delivers. It seems onward leading toward release instead of being onward leading toward more stress in my life. So here we go. In this chapter 12 from Ajahn Chah, it's a recording and then transcription of a talk he gave. And this is later in his life, as he was getting older. And so he's talking about the decline and dissolution of all conditioned phenomena. And you might have heard this is sort of a classic teaching from the suttas, from the Buddhist teachings when he was alive 2,600 years ago. All conditioned things, all conditioned phenomena, all the activity of the body and the mind arise and then they pass away. Everything comes and goes. This is the law, you could say. And do you know something that doesn't come and go? Even something like sometimes people will want to rarefy awareness. Well, sounds come and go, I know, that's true. Thoughts come and go, emotions come and go, mind states come and go, bodily sensations come and go, not nearly as fast as I want them sometimes. And, tastes and smells come and go. But awareness, knowing is constant. But even that you want to keep an open mind about. Because in one moment, awareness is knowing this object. In the next moment, awareness is knowing another object. Is it the same awareness? We don't really have any evidence to say it is or it isn't, do we? All we know is that in this moment, this is being known. And then the next moment, this is being known. That's what we know. And it's a skillful means to highlight, just as we're being awake, as we're being aware, present, to highlight that changing nature. And it's spiritual medicine, like to keep in mind decline, dissolution, the ending, the fading away, the passing away of experience. It's skillful medicine because it challenges this unquestioned, unacknowledged belief that there's solid ground, that there's something worthy of the mind's dependence, the mind's grasping, the mind's attachment. Like, for example, the belief, I'm me, and don't try to argue anything else. I know I'm me. And when I say that, when we say something like that, there's this idea that there's something solidly me. I'm the same me I was when I was 18 years old, and now I'm 66, and it's the same me. And then we, not it's subtle, but there's a kind of a grip, like, oh yeah, that's me. There's kind of a joke in Sufism. I don't know if people, Sufism is sort of a mystical branch of Islam, and well known in Persia, in Iran, that area of the world. And there was a whole blossoming of it back of 12th, 13th, 14th century. Some great teachers and poets like Rumi, Hafiz. And there was also this sort of wild wisdom guy called Nasruddin, and there's some recorded stories about this character. Not sure if he's even historically accurate, or kind of made up stories, but anyway, they're fun nonetheless. And there's one story where, a guard, one of the policemen at the time or whatever, sort of walks up to Nasruddin and says, please identify yourself, as in, show me your papers or something like that. And he pulls out a little shiny mirror and he looks and he goes, yep, that's me. And that's how it is. Like when we do that, when we recognize our body or mind, whatever's familiar, there's something extra that happens, which is this imagining that the me is something worthy of grasping, right? And there's many other things we grasp, like the idea, like when we're having a lot of pain in the body and we're meditating, like, this is terrible. And that idea, that whole construction of the me who's sitting with a lot of physical pain, and I hate it, and it's terrible, that's like an edifice that appears in the mind, because it's whipped up, it's constructed by, cognition, and the mind then grasps it as some essential truth. But of course, we've had sits where there's been a lot of pain, and we've had that mental construction that this is unbearable, this is unfair, why is this happening to me? And it felt so solid and real about me, and yet now where is it? It's past. And we've had, like even today, there have been many things that our mind has sort of grasped as me. Maybe you had a moment of humiliation or a moment of pride or just a sweet moment of being with a friend and just a lot of natural friendliness there interacting with a friend. And it was like in sort of the early Buddhist way, we would describe that as births and deaths. Oh, I took birth, there was a taking birth that lasted for some moments, and it was like this, and that whatever that sort of arising was, it lasted for a while and then it ceased. And then I was born into something else. I became, the sense of me doing whatever I was doing. That was a next arising, and a little sort of birth. And then in any given day, in any given hour, even in any given meditation period, how many births and deaths of being this, being that, experiencing this and experiencing that. Many, many hundreds, right? Maybe thousands that we were even partially conscious, aware of. In this chapter, Ajahn Chah uses the example of a big chunk of ice, and he grew up and taught in Thailand. He's a Thai Buddhist monk, and a hot tropical area, and it wasn't long before the ice becomes mushy and then becomes liquid and then maybe evaporates and becomes vapor, right? And it's just an example that things can have the appearance, clearly they do, of being solid and permanent and something that can be relied on as being something. But they are constructions. All of our concepts even, that it's 7:44 p.m. That feels pretty solid. Or I'm in Minnesota, or I'm male, or I'm straight, or I'm white, or I'm, whatever label. And these things can seem, when we use them, these concepts, they can seem as if they have a solidity to them that the mind can then stand on, exist in, depend on. That's why our society is kind of doing all these sort of flips and backflips and, stresses around the whole loosening of the idea of gender, and both, it started with sexual orientation, and even the sort of binary of male and female. People, probably more younger people, but it's just pervasive now in our culture. People realizing that binary of male or female isn't some absolute permanent entity that the mind can depend on. It's a construction. And we can, as a society, keep constructing a binary, or we can construct something else that's looser and more fluid and, includes more possibilities. But in any case, none of it is fixed. Whether you have a kind of a strictly binary, and that's just for whatever reason what the society is using, or you have something more fluid. But the point is, it's not fixed. It's a construction. And it's very easy for us humans, with our sophisticated language, capacity to use language, to get infatuated by what we create. We concoct ideas and then we get frightened by them. And one of my teachers says it's like little kids dressing up as a monster on Halloween, looking in the mirror and getting frightened. Oh my God, a monster. It's that, in a sense, silly when insight deepens. It doesn't mean that in a relative sense that these dramas aren't dramas. It just means that there's a bigger sense that's being missed. And we can't believe that there's a bigger sense that's being missed. We have to get interested and check it out. Believing it just is another way to create ground for ourselves. Like having the idea that God's got my back, and then believing that idea in a fixed way becomes something my heart has to constantly recreate and defend as solid ground. As opposed to, I don't even know who I am, let alone who God might be, right? It's like things are, the more we sense the relative and ambiguous nature of the mind's constructions, the more we acquire a taste for ambiguity and uncertainty and the vulnerability that comes with it, and then paradoxically maybe we feel more safe because we're in line with reality instead of pretending something to be that isn't. Because that's what's untenable. That's what creates existential anxiety. It's like the mind concocting something and then living inside of that concoction. But it's just a concoction, so it never really aligns or fits. It never really works. And then we get dukkha. And remember, I mentioned this a lot, so a lot of you have heard this, but the word dukkha means like when you have a cart, like they had back 2,600 years ago, and you have a wheel or an axle, but if it's out of true, the cart just does not work well. You know, it just doesn't do the job you want a cart to do when you're carrying a load of whatever, because the wheel is all out of whack or the axle is out of true, so it's not going to roll. It won't be useful. And that's the example of the Buddha when we are living with our normal self-centered concoctions, me trying to make sense of the world with my interpretation or my idea or my fixed allegiance to some philosophical or religious point of view, and then holding to it because I want it to make me feel safe, because now I have an answer, or I have an explanation or a picture that other people have created and then I'm borrowing and using, or I've created, doesn't matter. But it creates this anxiety, this uneasiness, because we're using and defending something, depending on something that doesn't actually align with nature, with the way it is. So the Buddhist approach was to stabilize awareness, present moment awareness, sensitivity, so that we sense, the more subtle underlying truth of the way it is, so the heart can align with that. And then to realize the peace, right, of that alignment. And what the heart realizes is that grasping isn't the way to safety or comfort or peace. Safety in the sense of having solid ground. Rather, real safety comes from non-attachment, non-clinging, realizing the non-need for solid ground, for depending on solid ground. If I imagine myself as a solid entity, me, well, that solid entity, me, is going to need something solid to exist in. A solid world, a solid situation, a solid sense of how things are. But if I realize that that solid sense of me isn't actually the way it is, well, then that need for something permanent, for solid ground, goes away. And the fluid, uncertain, ambiguous nature of things isn't anymore a problem. So often we start with just working with the body and just realizing like even the body itself isn't a refuge, a permanent ground for me, We like to think that, and whenever we have a period of relative health and well-being in our body, we misuse like periods of time when we feel healthy. Okay, now I got it. Now I can count on it. But can we really count on the body? He gives some really great graphic examples in this chapter. I'll just read a few passages. Now we tend to think of these bodies as pretty, delightful, long-lasting, and strong. We tend to think that we'll never age, never get sick or die. We are charmed and fooled by the body, and so we are ignorant of the true refuge within ourselves. The true place of refuge is the mind, or the heart. The mind, the heart is our true refuge. This meditation hall here may be pretty big, but it can't be a true refuge. Pigeons take shelter here, geckos take shelter here, lizards take shelter here. We may think the hall belongs to us, but it doesn't. We live here together with everything else. This is only a temporary shelter. Soon we must leave it. People take these shelters for a refuge. And I like how he says that, because he's not saying we shouldn't take advantage of our body and the health we have in our body, or the wealth that we have, or the intelligence that we have, or the friendships that we have, or the nice weather that we have. We had such a nice day in Minnesota today, right? But I can't count on the nice weather we had today, can I? You know, we all know what's looming, those of us who live in Minnesota. And we can't expect winter to be like last winter, where it was pretty mild. You know, we don't know how it's going to be. And that's really the point, is we don't know. It's ambiguous, it's uncertain, and we're vulnerable. Whatever this is, me is, I have to keep remembering that I'm vulnerable. This is not like an aberration or a mistake. This is just the way it is. We are vulnerable to change, to uncertainty and ambiguity. It's always been that way, but in moments we pretend it isn't that way. But that's delusion, that's pretending. And then there's an inevitable betrayal that comes when we pretend. So it's sort of an interesting thing about Dhamma, the way it is, that it's, you know, we think, oh, that's a problem that it's not dependable, that it's ambiguous and uncertain. But it's actually liberating, because it liberates the mind from the wrong way of relating, or the wrong way of interpreting what's going on here. And that's the only problem we have. Nature itself isn't a problem. The problem is something has arisen in nature, let's call it my egoic or self-centered approach to living, that's arisen. It's a little bit like a whirlpool in a river, which is just flowing from higher elevation to the ocean, right? But every once in a while, when the conditions are just right, you'll get a little whirlpool in that river. And strangely, the current of the river flowing down will go back on itself. And it will have some kind of coherence, this spinning. It's still the river. It's all generally moving toward the ocean. But there can be this unique little vortex happening. And a lot of wise teachers use that as a simile for what a human being, an ignorant and ordinary human being like us, what we are. We're like a whirlpool in a river. There's this natural flow into the great ocean, but when certain circumstances are such, then there's this seeming coherent thing that appears to be me, you know, and then we want to defend it. But it's hard for the whirlpool to stay ignorant of the river, you know, and so it requires delusion. You know, the mind has to be fixated on the swirl of the whirlpool and remain ignorant of the greater picture, the bigger picture. And so that's the Buddhist technique, right? It's like open the windows and doors, cultivate sensitivity wide and deep, keep connecting and opening and with humility to the way it is, and all problems get resolved. Because problems depend, you know, human suffering depends on being disconnected from the bigger truth, or the way it is. And where is that truth? Well, it's here and now. And that's what in Buddhism, early Buddhism especially, we call dharma or dhamma, the way it is. And you remember it's defined in these ways, sanditiko, apparent, here and now, right? So whatever the truth is, the Buddha is talking about something here and now, not philosophy, not a metaphysical statement, but something that's here and now, timeless, meaning it's always here and now, and its very nature encourages investigation. So to whatever degree, right now, for example, to whatever degree there's real curiosity about what's the way it is, and remember, we don't have to look somewhere else. The way it is, the way this is. And it's not about trying to conceptualize it, it's more all about opening, sensing, or letting this moment reveal itself, be what it is. So it's apparent here and now, it's timeless, it's always here and now. It naturally encourages investigation, meaning when we are authentically opening, you'll notice more interest. When you're disconnected, when you're lost in your thoughts about things, caught in your beliefs and fixed views about things, then you'll find it hard to remain interested, because there will be this some kind of certainty. And remember, this could be in a really negative form, like I hate myself, I hate my life, but I'm really certain that I hate myself and I hate my life, right? So there's no curiosity there. There's no openness, there's no humility. It's like, no, I'm really certain I hate myself and I hate my life. So it isn't just like having a fixed view, some fixed religious view or philosophical view. We can have all kinds of self-views. And the weird thing is we don't even have to be consistent. Like I mentioned earlier, through the course of the day, how many fixed self-views have we had today? Or even since 5 o'clock in the afternoon? Many. And it's so commonplace. And the sort of really amazing thing is we don't notice the inconsistency. That this is who I think I am, or this is what I think is going on, and then another moment. What the consistent part of it is the grip, the attachment. That's what's consistent. It's sort of going from one place the mind is congealing around to another place the mind is congealing around. And even really silly things like looking at the jar of peanut butter and going, well, that's a stupid label that those marketers put on that jar of peanut butter. But the mind kind of congeals around being the person who has an opinion about a label, right? And that will last for, 10 seconds or 45 seconds, or if you're really obsessive, 15 minutes, designing the perfect label for a peanut butter jar or something like that. I mean, we do that. We absorb into these things, they become our universe for a while, and then we, obsess about the fly that somehow got in the house or the apartment, and, and then we obsess about what we're going to watch on TV or what we're going to read on the internet. And then we obsess about what kind of meditation technique we should do when we sit. And, we absorb into these different things. And then after we sit, we absorb into the idea that that was a good sit or that was a bad sit. Or when am I finally going to get my act together around meditation? I've been doing this so long. And they're all just little births of self that the sense of self exists in until that drama can't hold itself together anymore, falls apart. But we don't notice the falling apart of it because we've already, in a sense, the mind, that habit, it's just an impersonal habit, leaps into another drama to cling to. And the more we practice, the more this starts to get illuminated, where we actually catch the mind, the habits, jumping from one thing to identify or get attached to another. And that's when the screws really start to get loose. We start to not believe that process of attachment. And we really start to understand the possibility of non-attachment. Anyway, I want to go back to just how the Buddha talks about the way it is. So it's apparent here and now, it's timeless, it encourages investigation, interest naturally arises, it has the flavor of freedom. Like the more we get interested in the way it is, even though opening to what is ambiguous and uncertain is initially maybe even scary or unnerving, But strangely, it's liberating, because the more the heart opens to the way it is, the more the heart is freed from having to deny the vulnerable, uncertain, ambiguous nature of this. And that's the flavor of freedom. So he names that, the Buddha names that. It leads to liberation. It's got that taste of freedom. It has to be experienced for oneself. That's the next attribute of Dhamma or Dharma. Nobody can do it for us. This investigation, this interest, this curiosity about the present moment, we have to do it. And in basically, lives can be described as either avoiding this so-called spiritual work or doing the spiritual work of opening. And the last is realizable by the wise, meaning with wisdom, that deep value of, you could call it a desire to see things as they are, which means there's a profound humility. Because if we think we know the way things are as a concept, then we're not going to be truly able to realize the way things are. That's why this word opening, or receiving, letting the moment reveal itself. These are just really important teachings. Ajahn Sumedho says, these are words, the way the Buddha defines Dhamma, these are words that point to here and now. When we're opening to truth, we're not looking for anything in particular, like focusing on one object and saying, is this the truth? Opening to truth is opening the mind, opening the heart, rather than focusing on one thing. And I wanted to share this passage from the suttas, the Buddha, from the Samyutta Nikaya, this collection of teachings. Practitioners, be islands unto yourselves. It's sort of an interesting thing, it's sort of, well, that doesn't feel right to say that in an interconnected world. But what he's saying is that when we open to our experience, which is interconnected, right, is this sort of dance of causes and conditions, when we do that, that's here and now in my subjective experience. So he's kind of saying, like, being islands unto yourself is that our own subjective experience is our teacher, and in that sense is a refuge. Be your own refuge, he says in this passage. Having no other, let the Dharma be an island and a refuge to you. Having no other. And that's the hard part, is like to give up those other refuges. Those who are islands unto themselves should investigate to the very heart of things. What is the source of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair? How do they arise? What is their origin? Here, practitioner, the uninstructed worldling, right, somebody who hasn't really trained their heart, take the 5 aggregates, right, the activities of the body and the mind, to be self. Change occurs in this person's body, in their mental activity, and it becomes different. On account of this change and difference, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise. Right? So what we have in our experience is the activity of body and mind. There really isn't anything else we're sensitive to. This is our world. Our existence is knowing or sensing the activity of body and mind. And when we take this to be me, then the me wants something more than this fluid activity of body and mind. It wants ground. So then the Buddha says, but seeing the body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. So this is one way the Buddha talks about the activity of the mind and body, called the 5 aggregates. But seeing the activity of the mind and body as impermanent, its changeability, its waning, its ceasing. One says, formally as now, all activities of body and mind are impermanent and unsatisfactory and subject to change. Thus, seeing this as it really is, with deep insight, one abandons all sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. One is not worried at their abandonment, but unworried lives at ease. And thus, living at ease, one is said to be assuredly delivered, right? Awakened, free. This is the insight of the Buddha that he shares and others have realized along the way. And it's really about coming into alignment, because coming into alignment with the way it is uproot this self-centered wrong view. Nothing else will uproot it. We can't uproot self-centered view from a self-centered point of view. Like me, as a self-centered person who realizes how unworkable my self-centered view is, I can't get rid of it. I'm still in that whirlpool, trying to get rid of the whirlpool. But all the whirlpool sees is the whirlpool. So the way out is to, being the whirlpool, is to cultivate the sensitivity to take in the bigger picture, the deeper, wider picture. Right? And then the causes for the whirlpool are uprooted. So here's the Ajahn Chah talking about this passage that I just read from the Buddha. And it's really pointing out that our self-centered existence, kind of our ordinary way of managing and being in the world, it's just unavoidably a setup. There's no way to make it work. In India, way back, I think it's like an ancient proverb. It's sort of like the curly tail of a pig or the curly tail of a dog. You can straighten it, and then as soon as you let go, it's going to be curly again. And they use this attempt to make our life straight, or to make our situation solid, safe, to address vulnerability by trying to get rid of all the insults. Has that ever worked? Have you known anybody that it's worked for? No. We never, being embodied in this way, with a mind in the way that it is, in a world the way that it is, there is no safe spot. We're vulnerable to change. We don't even know how it's going to change, but we know it will change. So whatever privileged situation we might have at any given time, we only know one thing for sure, is that it's going to change, that it can't be relied on in a lasting way. So Ajahn Chah says, the heart is the important thing. The Buddha taught to find a refuge within your own heart. Make yourself a refuge unto yourself. Who else can be your refuge? The true refuge is the heart, nothing else. You may try to depend on other things, but they aren't a sure thing. You can only really depend on other things if you already have a refuge within yourself. You must have your own refuge first before you can depend on anything else, be it a teacher, family, friends, or relatives. If we don't have wisdom, everything around us will be a source of suffering. If we are wise, these things, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, will lead us out of suffering. Eyes aren't necessarily good things, If you're in a bad mood, just seeing other people can make you angry, can make you lose sleep. Or you can fall in love with others. Love is suffering too. If you don't get what you want, love and hate are both suffering because of desire. Wanting is suffering. Wanting not to have is suffering. Wanting to acquire things, even if you get them, is still suffering because you're afraid you'll lose them. There's only suffering, and how are you going to live with that? You may have a large, luxurious house, but your heart isn't good, it never really excuse me, works out as expected. So it's not about creating a dismal or depressing picture of the world. We want to see that this opening to what is uncertain and vulnerable and ambiguous, we want to sense, as painful and challenging and unnerving as it might appear in moments, but it also has the taste of liberation. It's liberating, because we're going from trying to protect something that can't be protected, trying to rely on something that's not reliable, to coming in alignment with something that is trustworthy. You know, we presume that change, uncertainty, even something like pain, we just assume it's a personal problem without having actually investigated. You know, what is pain? Emotional pain, physical pain. And it's really hard to get beyond our arrogant certainty. Well, I know what pain is. I don't like it. And it's threatening. And we just leave it at that. And of course, it takes some real stability. It takes, you know, this sort of chicken and egg phenomena. It takes some safety to get interested in vulnerability. You know, we need, like some people translate this as, you know, you need a solid self to really investigate the fluid nature of self. You know, it's not so, when people start talking about not self, it's usually the self that somehow thinks it's a not self. You know, it gets really weird. It's really better to understand, like I really want to understand whatever this thing is that I'm calling me or myself, you know, and it's totally fine to call it whatever we want. So we don't need a different pronoun or whatever that myself word is. It's okay to use myself as a term. But what's not okay is not to be interested in what that is, like what that word points to. Because otherwise we just presume that the word like me or I or myself points to something without ever having looked. And wherever that is, it's right here. So it can be observed with that stability of present moment awareness. And what we always find is fluidity and change and uncertainty and nothing whatsoever that's fixed or worthy of grasping. Ajahn says, today's talk may be useful for those of you who can understand it. These things which you should begin to observe, they are our inheritance, right? Our teacher. They will gradually get heavier and heavier, a burden for each of you, each of us to bear. Right? Like we observe the body. We observe our fixed opinions and views, right? We observe what they are, like what they are in their essence are not worthy of grasping. They change, our views, our bodily experience, not dependable. And it's unsatisfactory that it's not dependable. And it's not even personal. How it changes, how things unfold, how our mind, our thoughts and views unfold. How our mind flits about from this fixation to that fixation. It's so interesting when we have some stability of awareness just to see what the thinking mind does. You know, it's just like judging and then planning and then concocting and then imagining and fantasizing and condemning ourselves for thinking. You know, it just kind of goes all over the place. And it's just a dance of past conditioning, which itself, of course, was impersonal. He says what's causing all the pain is simply conditions going about their natural way. And he calls this, like what he's saying, it's homework. I just want to end with another passage from the Buddha that I personally have been using a lot in my practice. And again, it's sort of subtle and deep, and may or may not be useful. But the translation I like goes like this. This is from the Buddha. One has no perplexity or doubt that what arises is only suffering arising, what ceases is only suffering ceasing. One's knowledge about this is independent of others, right? Because we're seeing it in our own experience. It's not that someone told us this is true. And then he goes on, he says, it is in this way, Kachana, who he's talking to, a student of his, it is in this way that there is right view. So this is the Buddhist defining of right view. Like really seeing things as they are means you're seeing that there's only suffering arising and suffering ceasing. Any experience is suffering arising and ceasing. So there's some sense experience, a sound, a thought, or whatever, a nice time, a bad time with a friend, whatever. There's an experience, and that experience is either suffering arising because the mind is misunderstanding that experience and taking it personally, so there'd be contraction, or the mind is not taking that experience personally, and there's the releasing of suffering. And in that way, the Buddha is saying there's only one thing, the arising and the ceasing of suffering. Now that's, in a sense, like if we wanted to know what's it like having a mind, a heart like the Buddha or an awakened one. Well, they see everything, they have sights and sounds and thoughts and reactions and this and that, just normal unfolding of human experience. But their perspective, their view of that is suffering arising and ceasing. So when there's clinging or taking it personal, there's suffering. And when there's not clinging, not taking it personally, there's the release of suffering. And that's actually what's more relevant than whether I'm listening to music or taking a walk in the woods or having an argument with a good friend that's really painful. What's relevant is there clinging, suffering, or non-clinging, non-suffering? That's actually what's more relevant to our heart. And that's what happens when we get interested in the present moment, is we realize that clinging and the release of clinging is what's actually relevant in any moment. So in a sense, and I say this to people when they ask me, I've been practicing pretty sincerely now for 42 years, and people will ask sometimes, what have you gotten from your practice? You put a lot of time in. I've been on retreat for almost 3 years of my adult life, formal intensive retreat practice, and what do you get from all that? And then all the daily sits, and what do you have to show for that, Mark? And it's like this growing, deepening curiosity about suffering and release, clinging and release. That seems relevant. And when there's clinging, the heart, the mind tends to recognize, oh, look at that, that's interesting. I'm tight. Things feel heavy. That's interesting, because I have enough confidence that it doesn't have to be this way. I may not immediately realize the release of that clinging, that attachment, but I know that the construction of the heart that's tight, that's attached, isn't the whole truth. So the mind's curious. What's not being seen or felt or noticed here? And in including the breadth and depth of what's here, letting go happens. Because the truth of the moment will not sustain attachment. Only being disconnected does the attachment make sense. Only being diluted does attachment make sense. So I'm going to leave it here, so we have some time to hear from some of you. We have about 8 minutes, time to hear from several of you. Questions, of course, are always welcome, but also your own reflections and learnings that might seem, for whatever reason, relevant to what I've said tonight. Who would like to share with the group. You can just go ahead and unmute yourself. Say your name, maybe share your pronouns if you want, and maybe even where you're from. Anybody want to get us started? Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Just a question. Um, if you could speak about whether there is a significant, important difference between non-attachment and renunciation.
No, it's that valuing, it's like, because renunciation covers a lot of ground, like feeling just a subtle impulse and realizing there are other options, like I don't have to go there, I don't have to say that, I don't have to do that. And so that's an act of renunciation, like to hold back. Or like I don't want to speak up, but because that's safer for me not to speak up, but I can renounce that relative safety and do something that feels right. So in a sense, renunciation maybe is slightly broader than non-attachment. It's like the overarching value that leads to the experience of non-clinging or non-attachment. So non-attachment is kind of a realization, like we realize, we don't do it. We realize moments where the mind is not dependent, is losing its need for dependence. It's losing its need for clinging, for attaching. And we realize, oh, look at the mind's releasing that. And it really arises because we've begun to recognize the value of renunciation. Like, we don't always have to do what we want. And the Buddha describes that as that willingness to let go of a lesser happiness, a lesser pleasantness, for a deeper one. Right? And that's just basic human learning, isn't it? You know, kids learn that. That famous marshmallow test, many of you know in Western psychology, you know, where they torture a kid by putting them in a room with a couple marshmallows on a plate and say, you know, you can have one now, and there's this other one sitting there. Don't eat that. I mean, you can eat it. It's okay to eat it. But if you don't eat it, you'll get 3 more when I come back in. So here the kid has just eaten a marshmallow and realizes, that tastes good. And they're staring at this marshmallow in this empty room. No one's looking. Of course, they've got a camera, a hidden camera somewhere, observing the kid to see whether they can wait for the greater happiness of getting the extra marshmallows or indulge in the one that's sitting there on the plate, right? And this is the thing about understanding the power of renunciation. So we're not subject to just doing whatever the impulse tells us to do. Because a lot of our initial impulses in any moment of our life are not very skillful. You know, they can really get us in trouble. Thanks, Joe. Anybody else? Thoughts, reflections from your practice, other questions? Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. And great to be here with everybody. I'm Steve over in St. Paul. And I would have been that kid who ate the marshmallow and then denied that I did it. But the thing that I try to think about this, the non-clinging part, and I can consciously do it sometimes, but I notice that throughout my day, if I review my day, there's a lot of times where I'm still just going in, on kind of autopilot. And overall, though, since I've been, coming to common grounds and trying to practice this, I've noticed some improvement, but I'm also, still struggling sometimes I get kind of confused, and I'll get fairly, wondering why I can do it for a while and then, and kind of be aware of things, but then it just goes away very quickly sometimes. And then, large parts of the day or small parts of the day just kind of, again, go on autopilot. Any suggestions?
Yeah, you know that line from the Buddha, patient endurance is the supreme incinerator of the defilements. So these habits to cling, all the ways we get attached in our lives, those conditioned patterns, they have the momentum that they have. And we have to respect that it's not personal, but we have the conditioning, whether it's ancestral or from our culture or from our parents and our upbringing or genetic or who knows. But we have the conditioning, the mind has the conditioning it has. It's real, but it's impersonal. And so what we're doing is we're growing other strands of conditioning, like this valuing of renunciation. And we're recognizing the value of it. So we build that even when we're getting swept away by these habits of clinging and attachment, we still can develop the value of renunciation because we can be curious, like we recognize I'm attached and I'm acting this out, this addictive pattern, let's say, but I'm aware to some degree that I'm doing it, and I'm curious, how's this working for me? Right? So then we're seeing that the attachment, that the non-renunciation, we see the consequence of it. And that builds the value of renunciation, the trust, and accepting the real pain of refraining in order for the greater good that will be delivered as things unfold. And that's that patient endurance is the supreme incinerator. It burns up the momentum, the very real momentum of these habits. But it takes time. And the way it gets burnt up is seeing that these habits don't deliver the promise that they appear to promise. There is a short-term, obviously, gratification. There's something juicy in these habits, but it's not what we are being promised when that habit is acting itself out. We're being promised something substantial, or we wouldn't be addicted to that pattern. So we have to observe that there's a lie there over and over and over again, and it's painful to see it. Walking down the same street, falling in the same hole. First we blame someone else, like you said, Steve. That's the first approach, right? Someone else took the marshmallow. I didn't eat that marshmallow. Somebody else's fault. And eventually we realize it's my fault. In that relative sense, like I identified with this particular pattern, I took it personally, I thought this promise was going to deliver. Once again, I realized it didn't deliver. I know a little bit better. That pattern is going to be a little bit weaker. I'll have a little bit more resilience next time. Well, nice to be with everybody. Deborah, do you want to have the last word? We could go over a couple minutes.
Okay, okay. So after he achieved enlightenment, did the Buddha still suffer?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. We should find that out for ourselves because people have the same depth of insight that the Buddha had. The Buddha was just, the reason he's got the title the Buddha is he came to that understanding without the teachings from a Buddha. And the other sort of attribute of a Buddha is that he can articulate what happened to him in a way that supports others. So many people have had that insight. Maybe, it's not like it's common, obviously. And many of us, who are teaching, and even those of us here in the Zoom call, have had in the direction of that insight, flavors of that insight, intuitions of that insight. And what that insight is that there is the very real pain of loss, the pain of physical pain, the pain, all kinds of pain, discomfort in life. It just comes with the territory. But we attribute that pain to me that somehow feels violated by pain. that is a construction that doesn't need to be there. So what pain is when it's not being taken personally is to be discovered, each of us. And this is not way out there, Deborah. Like just at the beginning insight is like we're sitting and there's some discomfort, something ordinary, like a little itch on our face or a little throbbing in our knee, but not overwhelming pain. And initially, the habit of the mind is to defend itself. I hate this. How am I going to sit for another 30 minutes when my knee hurts like this? But you sit with it, and you remember the instructions to get interested, to be intimate, to not believe that I have to get attached to some view like my knee pain is bad, but just to see it in its elemental nature, the throbbing, the burning, the whatever it is. And then you might experience like all of a sudden, whatever is going on in the knee hasn't changed, but there isn't anybody having a problem with whatever's going on in the knee. In that moment, there is an emptiness of somebody having a problem. And that's a little bit of what it's like to be an awakened being. It's like you've got a life, you've got relationships, you got the messiness that comes with life. You know, power differentials and navigating this and getting old and all of these things. In that chapter, Ajahn Chah talks about all the pain he had when he got into his 60s with his teeth. Finally, he told the so-called dentist to take the last 14 teeth out. And he said it almost killed him. But he just couldn't stand all the problems he was having with his teeth. And he, for the last number of years, just had false teeth in. But, it's just like enlightened beings don't avoid these sort of very real things, but they don't construct anything around the pain. They don't construct a person who's having a problem with emotional and physical pain. Yeah, and we should probably leave it here.